Go ahead.
Hell.
Yes.
Why do you believe in hell when there's no evidence whatsoever in everlasting hell? I mean, it's zero. So why do you? I know you talk about it sometimes about hell and you believe in it. I'm sure you do. But why when there's no evidence? I mean,
Brett, how would you get evidence for an afterlife?
Yeah, exactly. So why would you believe it knowing that you don't have any evidence for it?
Hey, Brett, is this Brett Strong?
Yeah, it's Brett Strong.
Brett, in order to get evidence for an afterlife, you would need revelation. I mean, you could look at near-death experiences, and I don't know if you've seen any of the recent work out there on that. Near-Death Experience by Eben Alexander. What's the name of that book? I got that book on my shelf, too. What's that?
Is he a doctor?
He's the neuroscientist, yeah.
I hope you realize, when you pull that one out the hat, I saw an article recently. I can't remember exactly the name of the article, but one of the head nurses in charge of over him basically said that it wasn't as the book said, like he was being fraudulent writing that book, that it wasn't as dire as he said it was.
Well, I don't know. I just started to read the book, so I'm not qualified to really speak on what.
It's debunked already, and they've asked him. He's basically hasn't said too much about it, but they basically said the book is basically a lie as far as how dire his situation was with no signs that he did.
Okay, well, I haven't heard that, so I can't comment on it. But his isn't the only case, quite obviously. There are scores of near-death experiences which show that naturalism is false. If you don't want to go to Revelation, now quite obviously, Revelation, if, say, the Bible is true, then that certainly is evidence that hell exists, because Jesus, who was God and claimed to be God and proved he was God, says there's a hell.
Yeah, but you can't even say that, Frank Turek, that Jesus proved he was God when the first century, we don't have anything from Jesus the entire first century. So when you use the word prove... Wait,
Brett, how did you come to that conclusion?
Okay, go to any university in the world, ask William Lane Craig, Dan Wallace, who's a textual critic, Bart Ehrman, they will all tell you, we don't have anything from the first century that has anything with Jesus' name on it. Nothing.
Well, Brett, hold on. What you're confusing there are manuscripts with testimony. We have testimony from the first century, but we don't necessarily have manuscripts from the first century, with the exception of a new one that, quite frankly, is in the first century that Dan Wallace will tell you about, but that's beside the point. That hasn't been actually published yet. We have testimony from the first century, but we don't necessarily have manuscripts from the first century. But that doesn't mean we don't have evidence from the first century.
So you're still in an assuming position and not fact. Because the fact is, I'm speaking fact, you're assuming. I'm saying fact, we don't have anything, and that's a fact. You're assuming there's something.
Hey, Brett, hold on. Brett, please. You're making assertions without providing evidence. We have testimony from the first century. That's not even disputed among atheists. For example, the testimony from 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 to 8, which is probably the oldest evidence in the entire Bible for the resurrection, even atheists, Brett, admit is prior to 40 A.D. That's not up for dispute. Okay? So the testimony is quite early. Now, do we have a manuscript that was written in 40 A.D.? No, we don't. We don't have the physical manuscript, but we have the testimony from that particular time.
Okay,
Now, Frank Turek pulls out Apostle Paul, and watch. I totally destroy that angle of, we have testimony from the Apostle Paul, Corinthians. Watch how I totally destroy Frank Turek for saying that. And when he realizes he's gotten, when he realizes he's been Brett Strong facepalmed, he mutes me. As soon as I say, he realizes, like, whoa, this guy's really got some stuff for me. He mutes me, and then he finishes on out. So I'm going to face palm him right now. And he's going to call Dale Martin, woozy professor at Yale University. This guy, Dale Martin, is one of the top PhD ancient historians in the world. And watch what Frank Turek has to say about Dale Martin, whom I use to show him that when you want to use the Apostle Paul letters, you still got nothing. This is Brett Strong, folks. Check it out. And when I say it and he realizes it, he mutes me. And then he finishes out a long monologue. Here we go.
How can you say that as far as it's written in the first century when the letter itself doesn't even date it? You have to assume that this letter was written in the first. It's all assumption. It's assumption that Paul wrote it. It's assumption is in the first century.
No, Brett, it is not assumption at all. Scholars who work on this, and let me point out, there is not one credible New Testament scholar, not one, that denies that Jesus existed, or that denies that, say, Paul existed and wrote 1 Corinthians in 55 or 56 AD. Even Bart Ehrman agrees with this, Brett. Okay?
Yeah, you know Dale Martin.
Okay, I just said Dale Martin. Okay, I got my timing a little mixed up. Here it is. Frank Turek gets face-palmed by Brett Strong. And I just said Dale Martin, Yale University. Who's the professor? He's top-notch, the elite, one of the best in the world. I use it against Frank Turek. He's stunned. He doesn't know what to do, so he mutes me. Watch me facepalm Frank Turek right now.
A friend of Bart Ehrman. He's a University of Yale, prestigious ancient historian, and he said that there's a common joke in the university about Apostle Paul letters. They're like, well, who wrote Apostle Paul letter? Oh, Apostle Paul wrote it. Which Apostle Paul? And Dale Martin says, well, we just assumed that it was this Apostle Paul, but we don't know because we don't have anything and we're not back there, so we're just assuming that Apostle Paul, that we think Apostle Paul wrote it. That's Dale Martin. You can watch it on YouTube, lectures on Yale University.
Okay, Brett, yes, I said one credible scholar, and I don't know.
He's like, I said one credible stuff. Dale Martin is not credible. His credentials crushes Frank Turek. Dale Martin. Frank Turek has no idea what he's saying right now, and he's gonna admit it. He doesn't have no idea who Dale Martin is, because if he did, there's no way he would say it, because he's right up there with Bart Ehrman. Frank Turek is out of his league when he deals with Brett Strong, as is any Christian apologist. William Lane Craig, whatever. I am that good on this subject.
Who you're talking about, but the point here is...
See, Frank Turek just said, I don't know who you're talking about. He does. Dale Martin, look it up, folks. Yale University. Look it up. You'll see. He's elite, top notch. So at this point, Frank Turek mutes me because he's like, wow, I've never heard that before. I've never heard anyone say that the Apostle Paul letters are even in doubt. Like, I never heard that. And this is one of the top leading ancient historians in the world. Flat out says, hey, Apostle Paul letters? How do you know they're Apostle Paul letters? I don't know. He says, they all seem like they're written the same, so we just attribute it to Paul, but we don't know. I mean, we're not back there, so all the Apostle Paul letters are attributed to Paul, but there's no foundation. They're just like, hey, they're all written the same, so let's say Paul wrote it, and that's what we accept it as. See, Frank Turek has never heard this before. He hasn't done his homework. That's what happened when you preach to the choir. That's what happened when you do all these Christian conferences. You miss out on the top ancient historians around the world, what they're really saying about academia, first century. So Frank Turek is out of his league when he deals with Brett Strong in this area, because this is my area of expertise. So he's muted me, folks, because he realizes, okay, this guy's Brett Strong's on another level. He's not your average atheist. He's on another level. So I'm muted. So I'm gonna finish it out, let him, and he's gonna give a long monologue. And I won't say anything because I'm muted. So I'll catch you on the other end.
Is that you're going to have people talking, obviously, have different opinions over different things when it comes to the New Testament documents. But it's quite well established that Jesus was an historical figure, and we do have testimony from the first century. That's not disputed among reliable, credible New Testament scholars. And you can just look at the evidence.
Now, hang on. He just said Jesus was a living figure, and then he put a disclaimer. Then he said, well, credible scholars. Well, John Dominic Crossing would say, hey, the New Testament, Jesus flying around, that's not real. John Dominic Crossing was DePaul University. Bishop Shelby Long. He'll flat out say, man, the Gospels are fake. Richard Carrier. Same thing. It was like, dude, the Gospels, it's fake. Richard Carrier's PhD. Dr. Robert Price, he's got 2 PhDs. And the college professor says, hey, the Gospels, Jesus, this is fiction. It's all fiction. Marcus Borg. So he wants to say, well, no credible scholar. Well, what do you call credible? I mean, that right there is subjective because, you know, Dr. Robert Price has 2 PhDs and is a college professor, and he would tell you, Jesus, the New Testament, Gospels are fiction. Well, I'll continue on. I'll let him speak because I'm muted on this radio debate.
To yourself, we have the evidence that we put in our book. I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. We've got eyewitness testimony throughout the New Testament document.
Okay, eyewitness testimony. Okay, once again, Dr. Robert Price, double PhD professor, would say, we don't have testimony. We don't have eyewitness testimony. These are fictional stories.
We have early testimony. We know that these documents are written down early. We know they put embarrassing details in.
Hang on, he said, we know that these things were written down early. Okay, even Mike Licona said that the earliest you could say the Gospels were written would be the late 1st century. That's not early. Jesus supposedly died, crucified on the cross, 30 AD. Mike Licona, his own peer, would say, hey, you can only put the Gospels in the late 1st century. So that's not early. So he's wrong again, Frank Turek, even by his own peer's standard.
There, they wouldn't have made up. We know that many of the apostles went and died excruciating deaths for saying.
Okay, excruciating death. Okay. Bart Ehrman flat out says, there is no reliable documents that document the disciples dying a hellish death for Jesus. Bart Ehrman flat out says it all the time. Like, there is no reliable documents in this world that shows that the disciples died for their faith in Jesus. Not one. Matter of fact, it's so bad that Gary Habermas won't even say that anymore. Gary Habermas will not say that the disciples did in fact die for their faith in Jesus. Gary Habermas, folks, will not say that. Frank Turek is saying something that his own peers don't say. And the reason why Frank Turek says that, because he doesn't know. He's been preaching to the choir, and he doesn't know his own peers what they're saying. Gary Habermas would not sit there and say that the disciples did indeed in fact die for their faith in Jesus. It's not historical. Frank Turek is wrong. Gary Habermas would tell him that, actually.
They saw what they saw when they could have saved themselves. Otherwise, we know there are extra biblical sources out there, like
he's going to extra biblical sources like Josephus. That's like 70 years after Jesus supposedly walked on earth. That's called early. That's called testimony for Jesus. 70 years. Josephus was born after Jesus supposedly lived, died, and was crucified. Therefore, Jesus supposedly died on the cross, right? 30 AD. Well, Josephus was born right around 36, 37 AD. So Josephus was born a decade after Jesus supposedly was crucified. So there's no way that Josephus could be a witness. You see how bad Frank Turek's method criteria is? It's really bad. And I love Frank Turek. He's a nice guy. We're going to do some beers. But when he's dealing with somebody at my level, Brett Strong level, which I consider myself one of the top in the world, and these types of things, Frank Turek is outclassed. And so I don't blame him for muting me out, because I would mute me out if I was in his shoes too, because, hey, I would say this guy's great. So let's go.
Josephus, Tacitus, Suetonius, Thales.
Okay, all those guys. Tacitus, Suetonius. That's almost 100 years after Jesus supposedly died on the cross. 100 years. Jesus supposedly died, crucified, fed his body to the dogs right around 30 AD. He's bringing up Tacitus, Suetonius. That's about 100 years later. You call that testimony for Jesus? Do you see how shabby the job Frank Turek is doing?
Phlegon. These are people that give us little insights into what the apostles and the New Testament believers believed. We have Old Testament prophecy, which should get us to expect something like this happening. And
Old Testament prophecy. How easy is it to write a part 2 to part 1? Old Testament. Okay, people back then had the Old Testament. Well, let's write part 2. Oh, that's easy. I can do it. I can write part 3 to the Bible. Matter of fact, the Mormon book is part 3 to the New Testament, I do believe. So you got the Old Testament, New Testament, and the Book of Mormon. But anybody can write a part 2, so that's not testimony. Anybody can take a pen and say, part 3. I can write a part 4 to the Bible. Part 2, part 3. It's easy. Just write it in. So that's not testimony, Old Testament. Just write it in. You want prophecy? I'll write it in. Phew, prophecy. Jesus came, died. There you go. Let's continue, folks.
In the first century, we even have enemy testimony. In other words, we have the Jews admitting the tomb is empty. We even have Jews becoming Christians. In fact,
of course, the tomb was empty. Jesus, the historical Jesus, that is, if there is such a thing as far as a mere man historical Jesus, of course the tomb would be empty, because his body was being eaten by dogs at that point. That's what they did to criminals in the first century. And there were many Jesuses, many Messiahs, many miracle workers in the first century Jewish. So Jesus was one of many, unknown, because he was a mere. If there was a historical Jesus, he was a mere man. But let's keep going.
The early Christians were mostly Jews. So we've got very good evidence, Brett. So I
now you just heard him. We got very good evidence. He calls very good evidence. We have nothing from the first century. Until Dan Wallace comes out and says to the world we do have a first century fragment of Mark from the late first century, until he comes out, which he hasn't. So at this point, Frank Turek said, we got great evidence, but yet we have nothing from the first century. The first century, folks, was empty. All things Jesus. Gentile source, Jew source, Roman source, Greek source, zero. This shocks Christians. The entire first century, what we have in our hands, nothing of Jesus. It doesn't exist in it. You have to assume, like I kept telling Frank Turek, you have to assume that Jesus lived 38 days. You have to assume it. Think about it. Everything about Jesus is hearsay. Jesus never, if he did live as a mere man, he never wrote anything down. So just anything about Jesus, it's all hearsay. What so-and-so said, what so-and-so said. Never what Jesus said himself. Everything is hearsay. But worse than hearsay, we don't have anything from the first century. So if you gather anything from this podcast of our debate, me and Frank Turek, understand this. There is nothing from the entire first century.
Highly recommend that instead of making assertions like this, you really look at the evidence.
Okay, folks, I just spoke fact. We have nothing from the first century. Frank Turek, I really don't know what he was talking about. Like I said, I think he's behind on his criteria. He's not used to debating someone of my level. Let me continue with Frank Turek.
And then make a decision. But don't just make these broad charges that can easily be refuted. Now, maybe we can...
Okay, easily be refuted. Okay, Frank Turek. I'm speaking to you, Frank Turek, right now. If I could easily be refuted, Frank Turek, then why did you mute me for the entire monologue you just said? You muted me for the whole time. If I could defeat anyone and refute him, I wouldn't mute him. I'll just defeat him right on live on air. Right? You see, everything he said, my reply was more dominant, firm, and strong. Everything Frank Turek said was an assertion. Everything I said was a fact. Everything. Folks, talk to any of the PhD ancient historians. Everything I said was a fact in that debate. Everything he said was an assertion. And until Dan Wallace comes out and says that we, in fact, do have a first century document, then the entire first century is empty. Period. Nothing. And thus, everything said about Jesus has to be an assertion, has to be a guess. Because there is nothing, folks. There is nothing. So since the entire first century is void of Jesus, nothing of Jesus, doesn't know anything of Jesus, since the entire first century knows nothing of Jesus, everything about Jesus has to be an assertion. It has to be a guess. It has to be, well, this is what we imagine. Because there is nothing from the first century. This is Brett Strong. Signing off.